O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are but children. Those were the words of an Egyptian priest to the Greek lawgiver Solon. It reminded that Greece, for all its pride and intellect, was still young beside the ancient wisdom of Egypt. Before Athens built its first temple, before Rome carved its first law, the African civilization of Kemet had already mastered the sciences of the heavens, the earth, and the soul. Over 3,000 years, Egypt guarded knowledge as something sacred. Geometry, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, all preserved within its temples, passed only to those deemed worthy. So when the Greeks finally arrived to learn from the Nile, they were stunned. They had discovered a civilization that had already done what they were only beginning to imagine. This is the untold story of how Africa, through ancient Egypt, shaped the foundation of Greece and Rome, a story of knowledge, secrecy, and power, and how that legacy still lives within us today. For over 3,000 years, the temples of Egypt were more than places of worship. They were centers of learning, the world's first universities. Knowledge in Kemet was not free for all, it was sacred, hidden and earned through discipline. The priests who guarded it were not simply religious figures, they were scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers. To enter their ranks required years of initiation, a transformation of body, mind, and spirit. Egyptians believed that wisdom was a divine force, one that could either uplift humanity or destroy it if placed in the wrong hands. That's why their greatest discoveries were kept secret, preserved only for the initiated. Inside those temple walls, there were charted stars with astonishing accuracy, built calendars to track the rhythm of the cosmos, and developed geometry long before Europeans even dreamed of such concepts. The Rhind mathematical papyrus shows them solving algebraic equations. The Berlin papyrus contains early forms of the Pythagorean theorem, over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. To the people of Kemet, knowledge was not just information, it was divine order. They worshipped it through Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, and Seshet, the goddess of learning and record-keeping. Even pharaohs had to be initiated into the mysteries. No ruler was truly fit to lead unless guided by sacred understanding. This was a society ruled by intellect, a government of the initiated. While other nations fought for land or gold, Egypt protected what it valued most, its wisdom. And when outsiders finally encountered it, they were humbled. To the Greeks who traveled south, this land was ancient beyond comprehension, a civilization so advanced that it redefined what it meant to be human. By the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, word of Egypt's wisdom had spread across the Mediterranean. And so, Greek philosophers began making pilgrimage to Africa, seeking the knowledge their own homeland could not yet provide. Thales and Meletus, often called the first philosopher of Greece, was among the earliest travelers. Ancient accounts say he'd studied geometry from the priests of the Nile, learning to measure the height of a pyramid by its shadow, a lesson that became the foundation of Greek geometry. Then came Pythagoras, who spent over 20 years in Egypt, studying in the temples of Thebes and Memphis. He wasn't simply learning mathematics, he was being initiated into sacred science. Egyptian priests taught him that numbers were not just quantities, but living symbols, keys to understanding the divine structure of the universe. When Pythagoras returned to Greece, he carried more than formulas. He carried philosophy, the idea that soul is immortal, that the universe is governed by harmony and proportions. All of it reflected the teachings of Egypt. What history calls Pythagorean wisdom was in truth African wisdom reborn. Solon, the Greek Athenian lawmaker, also visited Egypt around 590 BCE. The priest of Sas told him that Greece had no true ancient knowledge, that its people were like children compared to Egypt's civilization, which had already endured for thousands of years. That conversation humbled Solon and deeply influenced Greek thought. Plato too followed in their footsteps. He studied in Heliopolis and was inspired by Egypt's spiritual philosophy. The Egyptian's principle of Mat, truth, justice, and balance became the foundation of his vision for a just society in the Republic. Even the Egyptian idea of a single divine reality, the one who is the millions, echoes in Plato's concept of a higher invisible world of perfect forms. Eudoxus of Cnidus, another Greek scholar, studied astronomy in Egypt and later taught Aristotle. From him, Greek astronomy absorbed Egyptian star charts and calendar science, knowledge that would eventually define Western science for centuries. These were not isolated visits, they were pilgrimages, and every Greek who returned from Egypt came back transformed. To them, Africa was not a mystery, it was the source of all civilization. The influence of Egypt on Greece wasn't a rumor, it was a revolution. When the Greeks returned from Kemet, they carried with them the intellectual DNA that would define their civilization. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, all bore the imprint of the Nile. In mathematics, Egyptian geometry became the foundation of Greek reasoning. Herodotus himself wrote that geometry was born in Egypt, created to measure the land each year after the Nile's floods. Thales and Pythagoras simply refined what had already existed for centuries. Even the famous Pythagorean theorem was recorded in Egyptian papyri long before Greece began its philosophical journey. In astronomy, Egyptian priests had already mapped the stars, aligned the monuments with perfect precision, and created a solar calendar of 365 days. The Greek astronomer Eudoxus studied these teachings and brought them home, lessons that would inspire the work of Aristotle, Hipparchus, and later Ptolemy. Medicine, too, found its roots in Egypt. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, written around 1600 BCE, describes surgical techniques, broken bones, and wound care in remarkable detail. Greek physicians later built upon this knowledge, blending Egyptian science with their own observations. But the deepest influence lay in philosophy and religion. The Egyptian idea of Ma'at, the eternal balance between order and chaos, truth and falsehood, became the philosophical heart of Greek thought. When Plato spoke of justice and harmony, when he described a world of eternal forms behind physical reality, he was echoing Egyptian theology, the idea that all visible things reflect one hidden source. Even the concept of the immortal soul, so central to Pythagoras and Plato, came from the Egyptian understanding of life after death. The Greeks gave it a new language, but the roots were African. Egypt didn't simply teach Greece facts, it reshaped its worldview. It showed them that science, art, and spirituality could coexist. That knowledge was not just to be used, but revered. In time, the Greeks would pass this wisdom to Rome, spreading Egyptian influence across the entire Western world. But make no mistake, the spark that lit the golden age of Greece was first ignited on African soil. When Greece fell under Roman rule, its ideas lived on, and with them, the wisdom of Egypt continued to shape the world. By the time Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, the Nile had already been the cradle of knowledge for over 3,000 years, but instead of erasing that legacy, Rome absorbed it. Egypt became the empire's intellectual jewel, the beating heart of Roman science, philosophy, and religion. The city of Alexandria stood at the center of it all. Founded by Alexander the Great and nourished by Greek and Egyptian minds, it became the greatest hub of knowledge in the ancient world. Its legendary library gathered texts from every civilization, but its soul remained deeply African. Egyptian scholars working alongside Greeks and Romans pushed the limits of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. It was in Alexandria that Claudius Ptolemy compiled the Almagest, the great synthesis of Greek and Egyptian astronomy that guided humanity for nearly 1,500 years. And it was there that Eratosthenes, another scholar of African soil, calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing precision, using nothing more than shadows and intellect. The Romans, fascinated by Egypt, tried to imitate its brilliance. They imported obelisks from the Nile to decorate their cities. They adopted Egyptian gods like Isis and Serapis, building temples to them across the empire. From Rome to Poppy to Gaul, Roman engineers studied Egyptian irrigation systems, architecture, and construction techniques, hoping to match their mastery. They admired the pyramids as monuments of divine intelligence, feats of design that even Rome's finest minds struggled to understand. Through the Romans, Egypt's legacy reached every corner of Europe. Its wisdom was translated into Latin texts, absorbed into the empire's institutions, and carried into the future by scholars and priests. By the height of the Roman Empire, no educated person could deny Egypt's greatness. As one historian put it, Roman history is Greek, and both Greek and Roman history are Egyptian, because the entire Mediterranean was civilized by Africa. The knowledge that began on the banks of the Nile had now become the intellectual bloodstream of the Western world. Standing in the shadows of the pyramids today, one cannot help but feel something deeper, a connection to an ancient brilliance that time tried to bury. For centuries, Western historians wrote this story. They painted Greece as the cradle of civilization, while minimizing the African roots that nourished it. Egypt was treated as an anomaly, as if it were somehow separate from Africa, as if its genius had to be explained away. But truth has a way of resurfacing. The evidence is clear. Africa was not merely a participant in history, it was the foundation of it. Long before Europe emerged from its dark ages, Africans in Kemet were studying the stars, building monuments along with the cosmos, and exploring the mysteries of the human soul. The Greeks did not create civilization from nothing, they inherited from Africa and carried it forward. To recognize this is not to diminish Greece or Rome. It is to give Africa its rightful place in the story of humanity, because history, when told truthfully, reveals a single thread connecting us all, one that begins in the warm soil of the Nile Valley. For people of African descent, this truth is powerful. It restores pride where there has been distortion. It reminds us that we come from builders, thinkers, astronomers, and philosophers, not from silence or darkness. Every student who studies geometry, philosophy, or medicine continues a legacy that began in Africa. Every time we speak of justice, truth, or harmony, we echo the ancient principle of Mat. Reclaiming this history is more than a matter of pride. It's a form of healing. It breaks the chains of false narratives and reminds us the world that Africa was never behind. It was first. And for the rest of humanity, it's a call to humility, a reminder that wisdom knows no race, no border, and no monopoly. From the hidden temples of Kemet to the academies of Athens and the libraries of Rome, Africa's wisdom has shaped the course of civilization. The Greeks once stood an awe of ageless brilliance. The Romans built their empire upon it, and today we have the responsibility to remember where the light began. For too long, the story has been told in fragments, celebrating Greece while forgetting where Greece learned, praising Rome while ignoring who Rome studied. But when we trace the path of knowledge honestly, all roads lead back to Africa. The spirit of Mat, truth, balance, and justice calls us to restore the balance, to give credit where it's due, to see Africa not as a footnote in human history, but as its opening chapter. Ancient Egypt's influence is not just a relic of the past, it's a living reminder that knowledge, when protected and shared, can change the world. The same light that once guided the priests of Kemet, the philosophers of Greece, and the thinkers of Rome still burn in us today. So as we look forward, let this truth inspire us to think bigger, to learn deeper, and to carry the torch forward. Because when Africa rises, the world remembers where it came from. If this message spoke to you, share it, start a conversation, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, not just to grow this channel, but to grow awareness of the legacy we all inherit.